Hi, guys. Welcome to episode 6 of the Curious Cutlets podcast. And I hope you're all being safe and healthy and are keeping in high spirits in this uncertain and crazy time. Today, I'm joined with a special guest connecting in from Lisbon, Portugal, Miss Carolina Pereira, who is the co-founder of Tipping Up, which is a media platform empowering and connecting media activists to bolster social and political movements, and is also the media activist and storyteller for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals Action Campaign. Welcome to the podcast, Carolina.
Thank
Is there anything you want to add? I would love for you to introduce yourselves too.
you. Okay, thank you. I have been working mostly in as a human rights activist, mostly in gender equality and LGBTQ, and then in media activism. So human rights and media activism per se. But um, I think it was because of gender equality that I became also an advocate for he for she, and that's actually how I started to be more involved with LGBTQ issues. I would say like 3 years ago, and I'm really happy to be here with you because I also have an organization in India, in Chennai.
Great.
I'm the co-director of Satyam Project, and we work with girls and women to break cycles of poverty in Chennai. It's a very community-based organization. So like India, it's a beloved country, and I'm really happy to be here.
I'm so happy to hear that. Guys, today we're talking about IDAHOBIT, which is essentially the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, which happens to be this Sunday, May the 17th. And with all of this impressive portfolio of roles and jobs, Carolina, I want to begin by asking you that can you give us insight into IDAHOBIT and how you came about being so actively involved in this cause? And then I would be happy to hear more about the cause and how it's taken on as a movement around the world.
Sure. So, yeah, as you said, the Hobbit is the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, May 17. And it's on May 17. The date was chosen uh, because it was to commemorate the decision to remove homosexuality from the international classification of disease from by the World Health Organization, by WHO. And it was only in the 90s. I don't know the exact year, but it's very. I mean, it's still very fresh.
Yeah,
Um,
not long.
yeah, exactly. It's strange to to think. It seems something so I don't know, like so
Ancient
old.
concept, right?
Exactly, that it's strange to think that it was only in the 90s, and then actually, like it has been improving they have been improving the concept of the day, and it's everything very fresh. Like in 2009, transphobia was added to the name of the campaign, and only in 2015, biphobia was added to the name of the campaign.
Right.
Um, and so yeah, that's it. Like in 2009, I think ILGA reported that there's still 76 countries still consider same-sex relationships illegal, and in 7 of these countries, same-sex sexual acts are punishable by death. So it's basically there's still like a lot to do, and the day has um, been used to raise awareness and to create a global movement around the LGBTQ community. But I mean, not only to raise awareness, but also as a call for action.
No, I mean, it's insane to think about that these developments have been so recent, but it's still a great thing that these are happening. And
Yeah.
and just the idea that it's an ever evolving subject is great, because they've added transphobia, they've added biphobia, and that's really encouraging, because then it means more inclusive communities around the world, and that's great to hear. And I think that's going to lead to a lot of good in the world, when people
Yeah.
feel like they're being recognized and being able to identify themselves more securely around the world. I think that's a great feeling. So just adding on that, I want to get into the more personal side of questions. Like, have you witnessed the change in social perceptions of the LGBT community around you? And this can be your country, this can be
Mm-hmm.
Europe in general, this can be even in India, because I know you're so heavily involved in the LGBT sort of scene here also. And you're so well connected around the world, given that you're a global shaper, a part of the global shapers community of the World Economic Forum. So having all of those perspectives, how do you think has the change been? How rapid has it been? And all of those things.
Right. I don't know. It's always every time someone asks me that question, it brings me kind of mixed feelings because, for example, in Portugal, and I will just start by Portugal because that's where I'm from. I'm Portuguese.
Yeah.
From the year 2000 to 2010, Portugal became kind of like in 10 years among the best in the world in terms of LGBTQ rights.
Hmm.
But
You,
the
so
thing is,
can you expand that? Has it recognized same-sex marriage, or
yeah, yeah,
what's the
and
extent of it?
exactly same-sex marriage, and also um, basic like for transgender people, like the right, even during these COVID times, the right to
Hmm.
keep their um, medicine and all of it, like in terms of
Healthcare. Got it.
healthcare. And yeah, exactly, in terms of supporting the community, for example, to for you to decide if you want to change your sex on ID. I think the age right now it's 16.
Hmm.
And so it's basically in terms of law, it's protecting the community. But
Mm.
the thing is that Portugal is still very traditional, and society it's not keeping up with it.
Like most countries,
So
I would say. Yeah.
exactly. So it's always like a tricky. It's always like mixed feelings because, for example, so the law is advancing, but for example, for the first time in history in Portugal, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
or in the democracy history of in Portugal, um, there is one extreme right party in Portugal that it's on the government and defines LGBTQ education in schools as propaganda, for example.
Oh.
So you are seeing this strange scenario of laws advancing, but at the same time, uh, for example, we never had an extreme right party
Mm.
elected, and it's the first time we have it, you know. So it's those strange times. But I would say, like in general, that real progress has been made in the fight for equality, but it's just that we are not there yet, and
Yeah.
that's why it's really important to support LGBTQ equality and show governments around the world, not only in developing or countries or developed countries, that their citizens do not support the repression or abuse in any form, and that's
Right.
really really important.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, interesting that you bring that up, and I've seen this play out time and time again, even in India.
yeah,
And what you mentioned, that you take two steps ahead in terms of legal structure and legal rights and things like that, and then you also take a step backward at the same time. So this constant sort of struggle, I know, can be very frustrating,
yeah,
especially for people in the community. But I think that's a part of the progress, right? That eventually it's all headed towards a more open, accepting society. And but I wanted to get into what you personally think. Uh, how do you think that the social mindset can be changed, right? Like, because changing family mindset, traditional views, it's kind of controversial because, and
Mm-hmm.
then, comes the whole idea of freedom of speech and all of those political things. How do
Exactly.
you preserve those, but at the same time make a community and a country and a nation and the world more accepting and more inclusive? Because that's something I feel like all of us struggle with in terms
Mm-hmm.
of how do you make that happen? Because everybody's entitled to their views, but also everybody in the community should also be able to live freely and without judgment. So I want to hear from you about that.
Right. So, um, I think change has to happen in two ways. And this is not always, but almost always. And I was just thinking on it's almost the same, the same that this in the same stage that with the work that I'm doing with Satyam project in India, for example, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of women rights and gender equality. It's the that problem of advancing laws, but at the same time, the society it's not there yet. It's you kind of can relate. So I think from the experience with Satyam and trying to think about the LGBTQ community, but I think it's in general. Um, you have to change has to happen in two ways, so system and then grassroots or society, because we need law on our side to
True.
protect us, and but sometimes for the unprivileged ones, it can be very difficult for you to, for example,
Have a
go.
voice.
Exactly, like to go for a strike or something like that, because in many countries it's just very dangerous. So I would
Yeah.
say that in terms of changing the system, and that's really important because we need to have law on our side. I mean, if you are in a country that
Mm.
says that, you know, uh, being a lesbian is a crime, then it's really hard to work with the society, because it's just the
True.
government that is saying that. So
Yeah.
I would say that in a system way to break the system, those who have the privilege
Mm.
um, need to be accountable and need to stand up for
Right.
the ones who are unprivileged and don't have that opportunity. And in terms of empowering the society, in the other hand, we need to empower not only individuals but also organizations.
Mm.
Individuals in terms of raising awareness and basically uh, it's like it's not going against the values of a culture. It's basically trying to make them understand that everyone should have the same opportunity basically, and the conditions to live that opportunity. That everyone who should have the when you talk about freedom, not only free speech but freedom
Yeah.
in general, not everyone are
True.
having the same opportunity to
Absolutely.
freedom. And so it's just putting it in their way. It's not something that we choose as
Yeah.
LGBTQ community,
True.
and that's it. And in terms of organizations, the grassroots work, it's still really important, because even though it's a systemic problem,
Mm.
from generation to generation in a systemic way, it's there's still a lot of people around the world, from LGBTQ refugees,
Yeah.
from homeless, from people who have suffered different ways of violence because of who they are, who need support, and the organizations need to be able to protect them, because otherwise it's impossible for people to come out and to have role models or to speak up if we can't offer them protection. And so I
Yeah.
would say that you create change by doing those two things,
Mm.
changing, having the law on your side,
Uh-huh.
and for that the privilege have to stand up, and
Right.
empowering organizations and individuals in the same way.
Right. So I think essentially at the, if you really boil it down, it comes down to the fact that it's education and also then exposure, right? And just in continuation and sort of expanding upon what we just discussed, exposure is not something exposure to the LGBT community and to the idea that they're they're human beings, they're equal to everybody else, and therefore deserve equal rights as anybody else, right? How do you
Right.
think the LGBT individuals in developing countries, especially, I know even developed countries are not, completely where they should be in terms of equality, but especially in developing countries, or conventionally sort of homophobic or transphobic countries, how can those individuals, people, citizens of those places, can attempt to improve the quality of their experience, being in that society, and then also drive sort of change? And I know you can speak to that because you've been doing that so effortless, I mean, so tremendously in all of these years of your work experience and your volunteer experience.
For me, it's really hard to put the whole uh, responsibility for change on those who are the unprivileged one, the affected one.
Right.
Um, so, because even though I'm part of the LGBTQ community, I'm a white woman, for example,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so there's always different scales of privilege,
True.
and I live in a country where that's legal, even though um, a lot of people choose not to come out to because of the society, but still it's legal. But for example,
Right.
I have been in Kenya, and I have been trying to help an organization called Kenyan Rainbow Flag, and
Mm-hmm.
they work with the LGBTQ refugees, and
Oh.
yeah, and it's very, I mean, uh, it's very hard to for me to say, they are the ones, when you are affected like they are.
Yeah.
uh, it's really hard for me to say that they hold the responsibility for change. I think the best, basically it's related to what we were saying. We need to invest in organizations to protect them first, so that then after they can speak up and all of that, because I have studied a little bit of about the LGBTQ uh, history in Kenya, for example, and you
Mm-hmm.
have like a lot of activists who were killed, and
Wow.
they are homeless and refugees, and they are attacked in refugee camps. And there's basically a story of like a recent story of a gay refugee who hanged himself outside of the UN agency in Kenya, for example. So it's really really hard in there, and you need to, most of all, to empower individuals in general, so the society, and you need to build strong organizations and foundations so that they can be protected while they are doing their work. And again, I don't think for example, the responsibility uh, to strive on women's rights or to strive on LGBTQ rights
Mm.
is the responsibility for women or for the LGBTQ. It's a responsibility of everyone, and
Yeah.
that's where uh, privilege comes. And
Yeah.
even more, if you have that privilege, like you can take advantage of it, and really help to make the difference. And I think in these kind of countries, what we were saying about that balance, or working in those two fronts of system, but also grassroots and society, it's even more important, because maybe, in a country like Portugal right now, we need to work more with society and grassroots, because the government, it's kind of aligned.
Hmm.
In developing countries, we really need to working on both sides, basically.
Right. No, I mean, you answered it absolutely. I think that there was no better way to put it. This is what I was trying to drive, this is the point I was trying to drive home, is that at the end of the day, people who are who are in a position, I don't want to say victims, but,
Hmm.
they're in some way, they're a victim of, the systemic problem. And I think the onus doesn't fall on them. I think the responsibility then goes to the people who don't bear the same burdens and have the same troubles and problems as these people do. And this is not just the LGBT community. You're right. And with women, men need to be equal supporters of women's rights and women equality and things like that. So I think it just falls on every individual to uphold the rights of their own, but also everybody else's.
Yeah, and,
Yeah,
and also I think there's a huge responsibility on media, because
true, true.
there's so many. For example, there's so many stories and things going on during, for example, these COVID times,
Mm,
where several ring right governments are using the COVID situation as a mean to pass anti-rights legislation, like Poland, Hungary,
yeah,
or Egypt. And there's, for example, stories of queer Ugandans who were arrested in a raid of shelter. And then, I mean, there's a lot of situations that are going unnoticed. And it's really important to have those stories, because um, basically stories shape culture, because they create visibility and
absolutely.
change mindsets. So it's really, really important to give voice to what we know to be true.
Yeah,
And we have known for many years that media, it's super powerful in terms of doing pressure or on governments or even societies, and
sure.
on, using social media, using ads. And there's a lot of case studies in terms of how stories and content in general, news, really can shape realities. And so I think we were just talking about responsibility, and that just came to my mind, not only in governments, organizations, society, but also media.
Correct. Absolutely. I think that's a great point to add. But I think I want to ask you, just as a follow up, that why do you think, because I know you're also involved in the media space, you're a storyteller for, the United Nations and, all of that. I want to ask you, why do you think that these instances of homophobia, these LGBT issues sometimes fall through the cracks, and, don't catch the media's attention? Do you think, is it something that happens on purpose, or is it something that unintentionally goes on, under the radar?
I think it's both. So, for example, during these COVID-19 times,
Hmm.
we are experiencing that, for, I think, every issue, for climate justice, gender equality, LGBTQ,
Mm.
because COVID-19 was not only defined as a pandemic, but also as an infodemic.
Yeah,
That's because, but those issues are getting unnoticed, but they didn't stop from one day to the other. Like the fight for climate justice didn't stop, or everything else. So it can happen both. It can happen that sometimes some issues are trending, and the news just want to write about that, because everyone wants to get updated on that every day, and then it's
yeah,
just too much content. We are living in an age of, it's not only fast media, I would say like too fast media. It's like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you just have notifications all the time and it's too much. But also, of course, in many countries, in many realities, there's it's really hard to get those stories, and that's not just because of COVID, for example. That, I mean, in Kenya, or in other countries, or and even in India, for example, that can happen with women, and basically around the world, there's some efforts from governments, but also organizations. For example, not proud to say, but I mean the UN Refugee Agency, has no interest on sharing that because of the work that they are not doing. Like a gay refugee hanged himself outside of the agency, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's there's a lot of, it's really hard to put those stories out there, and usually what happens is these organizations, or actually these activists, is just people who really try to reach out to a lot of people and ask to a lot of media, to from BBC, CNN, and so on, to share their story. And 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 it's really difficult if you are only relying on those, because again,
Yeah.
they are not in a position to sometimes think about that, because they are just thinking about surviving, or the day after.
Commercial, yeah, commercial aspect of it.
Probably one of the answers for this would be to empower more people on mobile journalism.
Yeah,
So something that it's low cost and easier to do. And
yeah,
I think maybe also invest on media literacy for everyone, and local journalism. So basically, to don't have like a team stuck in New York that writes about all over the world,
yeah,
but
yeah.
to have people like in India, to have an Indian who can tell the stories from the ground.
No, great. I mean, those are, you made some great points in terms of that. I'm just going to be shifting gears a little bit now.
Yeah, sure.
And I want to get into your role in the United Nations in the Sustainable Development Goals Action Campaign. And how do you think the LGBT community is considered in terms of a priority in those development goals? Is that something you can shed light on? Because this is also a very pressing global issue. Every country's community, LGBT community, faces this. So is this on the radar and all the priority list for the UN, or is it something that's been on the back burner for most international organizations?
No, I think the UN has done. I mean, the UN SDG Action Campaign Department is a department focused on mobilizing, inspiring, and connecting people to take action for the Sustainable Development Goals, and that
Hmm.
means every one of each the 70 goals,
Hmm.
and LGBTQ rights are of course part of those goals, but I would
Yeah.
say that this department, it's more general. But
Yeah.
there's, for example, a department inside of the UN called UN Free and Equal,
Hmm.
and they are totally focused on LGBTQ rights. So basically, they are a department only for that, to create campaigns and other stuff to basically empower the community.
I was saying the United Nations Human Rights Committee, is
Yeah.
that heavily invested in this cause, or is that largely sort of disassociated from this concept? If there's anything you want to add in that regard.
No, I mean, I don't know the whole work of of the whole
Sure.
UN on it, but basically,
Yeah.
I know that, I mean, every department had. takes LGBTQ into account. There's
Yeah,
some departments more focused on that than others. For example, may probably even UN Women, because it works with gender equality, includes the feminist lens on LGBTQ
got it.
rights, for example. There's this department, the UN Free and Equal, um, that it's totally for the community. And I know that in terms of the Human Rights Commission, or even World Health Organization, or UNDP, for example, the United Nations Development Program, all of them or have the LGBTQ lens when they're working, or even like the UN environment, for example, because there's some links between LGBTQ and climate justice, for example, um, and that's and it's not that that, or even, for example, I was just thinking this issue in Kenya. They are being taken care by the UN Refugees Department. So it's not, but it's an LGBTQ issue. But at the it's just that some things, of course, are related to others. It's not like a one isolated issue.
Of course,
and
yeah.
and yeah, and because of that, all the departments are working for it. And I think I don't know, I think that in general they have been progressive and supportive of the community.
Mm,
But of course there's like super local issues that it's just very complex. For example, that at in Kenya, but also others. And for those cases, I do think that UN should have like basically to be more, I don't know, strength in terms of what to do, in terms of
yeah.
um, solutions.
Right. No, absolutely. I think it sounds like it's headed in the right direction. It's steps in the right direction are being made. At least the trajectory is onwards and upwards. So that's good to know. I'm just gonna coming to almost towards the end of the segment. I want to ask you essentially that how do you think allies can play a role in advancing your mission, in yeah, and also in being responsible citizens, especially for the LGBT community. So if you want to add something in that regard.
Sure. So allies, I would say that they are essential. It's not
Yeah,
even like really important. They are essential for the change, and we have talked about that even in this conversation. It's easy to understand those balances between the privileged and the unprivileged one, and of
yeah,
course, to in this case, to be a heterosexual, you are privileged. Um,
mm,
and and you can use that privilege. You usually in the history of change or social movements, there has been really powerful moments of uh, changing the narrative, and that happens a lot of times when basically the privileged ones take the side of the unprivileged. So when the ones who are part of the status quo, who are part the normative,
right,
say that um, those guys have the same rights as me, and that have happened with racial causes or movements, anti-racism, or women's rights, and so on. And the same for the LGBTQ community. It's really important to, again, to use the power of words and to give voice and to build movements, mobilize supporters, when even when you are not directly affected by the problem. I think that's sometimes even more powerful when it comes from those people.
Right. No, that's great. And I just want to give you an opportunity to sort of explain how allies on 17th of May, Sunday, how they can participate in the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. If there's anything they can do directly or indirectly, in any
Sure.
form or manner, on small, large, any quantum of action. That'll be
Sure.
great because then people have something to look forward to.
Yeah, so I would say that taking into account the COVID times we are in,
Right.
I'd say that basically to create visibility in which way, whatever way you can. So,
Mhm.
as we said, like stories do shape culture, and effective stories, even like effective stories as part of the community or as an ally, can create action and build movements and mobilize supporters. And the great thing about social media is how it gave a voice to voiceless people, for example. And
True.
so it's I would say that basically uh speak up, like words have the power to build people up, or confine people to where they are, or break people down. And the truth is that our voices can paint and create new perspectives, especially the voices of the privileged.
Right. No, I agree. I couldn't agree more. Carolina, I want to leave it to you now. That is there anything else you would like to share, discuss with whoever's listening? Any sort of advice for people who are coming to terms with their own, identity and things like that. Who has people who have a friend who's sort of struggling with this and who face sort of homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, that sort of thing. Any last few words of advice, and then I think we'd be ready to close.
Yeah. Um, I would just to as a final note, I would just to like to let people understand that there's no fight that it's more important than other, and that all the fights for progressive human rights are connected. And I really want to say that because sometimes, you know we are just overwhelmed by a lot of movements, and we kind of feel, okay, I need to dedicate my time for this, and I really need to care about this, and I don't have time for that. But basically, it's all part of the world we are living. And
Mhm.
the fight for climate justice is the fight for human rights,
Yeah.
and all these minorities that will be affected. Or the fight for women's rights is the fight for LGBTQ rights. And no one is a better human being if they leave someone behind. And so I will just say that we will never be able to change the world if we do not look at the planet in a holistic and inclusive way. And we really need everyone. So I that we are counting on all of those who will listen to this.
No, those are great words. That's very inspiring, and also it compels you to think beyond just yourself. And I think that's great. And that's the idea of us doing this podcast, sharing ideas. This is what we intend to do. And just quickly, Carolina, how can people who are listening to the podcast, how can they connect with you or learn from you or even work with you in advancing your mission and even, doing their own bit in wherever they're located?
Right. So I'm basically on social media. On Instagram, I'm at Carolina Salgueiro Pereira. Maybe you can then add on the
I will.
description.
I would guess.
Or even like tipping up Satyam projects, he for she. Basically, you can all get involved with those movements and organizations.
Right. No, thank you so much. I'll just quickly add that you can share this podcast on your timelines on the 17th of May, this Sunday,
Yeah,
to spread awareness, because that's our
for
idea
sure.
of doing this episode. And this brings us to the close of the episode. Thank you so much for coming on, Carolina.
Thank you so much.
Uh,
I loved it.
Yes, I'm so glad you were able to make time for this. I'm sure everybody who listens to this is going to go back much more, well informed, and more humbled and wanting to make a difference in whatever way they can. And it's been great. We would love to have you in India whenever you're here next. Please come visit. And
Chennai is a little bit far from your place, I think.
correct, correct. It is, but it's fine. We'll
We
manage.
will make it for
Yeah,
sure.
we'll make it happen for sure. Anyways, thank you so much. Have a great rest
Thank
of
you.
the day, and I look forward to connecting with you.